morning and welcome to the latest edition of the National Security Space Association's SpaceTime interview series. My name is Chris Williams and I have the privilege of serving as chair of the Moorman Center for Space Studies, the association's in-house think tank. The Moorman Center is named in honor of the late General Tom Moorman, one of the best and brightest in the storied history of the U.S. National Security Space Program. We are deeply honored to carry forward the name and legacy of General Moorman. He was a great leader and a dear friend and mentor to many, myself included. Today, we are very pleased to be joined by Mr. Eric Desautels. Eric is the Senior Coordinator for Emerging Technologies and Security Domains in the Arms Control Verification and Compliance Bureau at the Department of State. He leads the department's efforts related to missile defense and space security, among other important issues. Eric, it's great to see you, and thanks very much for being with us today. As many of our viewers know, space contributes mightily to the nation's political, scientific, economic, and national security interests. And the United States has a long and exemplary record of conducting safe operations in space in support of our national interests. I might add that U.S. interests clearly extend to cislunar space, where the strategic competition with China is heating up rapidly. In this regard, I call to your attention a recent paper issued by the Moorman Center entitled Strategic Implications of China's Cislunar Space Activities. It was written by Mark Berkowitz and me. That paper clearly lays out China's very expansive ambitions in cislunar space. U.S. interests are increasingly threatened in space, just as they are in other domains. China and Russia in particular seek to undermine the long-standing international order as well as the U.S. leadership position in space, and are fielding an increasing array of sophisticated space and counter-space systems to deny us the advantages of space in peacetime, in a crisis, in wartime. Diplomacy can play an important role in strengthening U.S. efforts to promote safe and sustainable operations in space. In this regard, the State Department has been leading U.S. efforts to identify and reduce space threats in various international fora, including the United Nations. The United Nations Open-Ended Working Group, or OEWG, on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior, recently concluded efforts to discuss various potential restrictions on certain actions and activities in space. Eric, my hope is you can fill our audience in on what happened, both from a procedural and substantive standpoint during the recent OEWG discussions, and where we go from here, not only in the OEWG, but in other fora, such as the Conference on Disarmament, coming up in New York. We have a lot of ground to cover today, so let's get right into it. For our audience, if you have questions for Eric today, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Eric, thanks again for being with us, and thanks for your long-time dedicated service to the nation. The floor is yours for any opening remarks you may wish to make at this time.
Well, thanks so much, Chris. Really appreciate the opportunity that you and the National Security Space Association and the Moorman Center are providing us to give some remarks about the work that we're doing on trying to create norms of responsible behavior in outer space. As you mentioned, I'm from the Arms Control Verification and Compliance Bureau, but my office doesn't actually do a lot of traditional space arms control. Yes, we have the Outer Space Treaty as one of our core issues to focus on, but really that is the one limitation: no placement of nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in orbit or on celestial bodies. Beyond that, there really hasn't been an agreement around what should we be doing in space, whether from a legally binding perspective or from a political commitment perspective. Dating back to the 1970s, in 1978, in fact, the UN decided that there should be a discussion on the prevention of an arms race in outer space, but we really haven't had a forum anywhere in a UN system where we can talk about things other than legally binding arms control agreements. Now, the US government has a long-standing policy that we are supportive of space arms control, and this policy actually dates back to the Reagan administration with very few changes. But if we were to enter into a legally binding arms control agreement, we could only do it if it was international security interests, if it applied equitably to all countries, and if it was verifiable. And we haven't gotten to a point where we see any of the one proposal out there could meet any of those criteria. And so as competition has continued to increase in outer space, we have sought to create a venue in the UN that brings together all states to really start talking about how we reduce the risk of conflict occurring in outer space. And so working very closely with our Department of Defense colleagues and also with some of our very close allies, we decided to create at the UN what is known as an open-ended working group. Open-ended in that any UN member state could participate. Also, we had the participation of non-governmental organizations, so entities like Secure World were able to participate in it, as well as entities like the International Committee on the Red Cross, or ICRC, which turned out to be very valuable in terms of providing their thoughts on the legally binding issues related to existing international law and how those would apply in outer space. We actually started this process in 2020. As an example of diplomacy taking some time. It took us some time to get a UN resolution passed, but then over the course of 2022 and 2023, the open-ended working group met in Geneva twice a year over those 2 years. And we wanted to go down this path because we felt that norms of responsible behavior were a better approach, an approach that we could quickly get to. We could make advances in terms of getting agreement on norms much faster than we could in trying to sit down and negotiate a legally binding instrument. Chris has a lot of experience with those attempts. It's not particularly a fast process, and the challenges we also have there, right? And that's one of the reasons we focused on behaviors, was it is a lot easier to observe a behavior than it is to understand intent or capabilities. It is very hard to define what is a weapon in outer space. And in fact, we had a lot of conversations around dual use systems because could an on-orbit servicer be a weapon, or is it a civilian activity?
Yes, yes.
Exactly. And so that's why we set up this open-ended working group, to really bring all the countries together and start having those detailed conversations. So the 4-meeting structure that we had was set up where the first meeting went over existing international law. The second meeting went over the threats to space systems. The third meeting was proposals on possible norms of responsible behavior. And then the fourth meeting was devoted to writing a report summarizing the conclusions. Now, we felt that this was a really great opportunity. So we held it in Geneva at the Conference on Disarmament, because that tends to be where UN discussions on space arms control occur. But there are only 65 countries that are members of the Conference on Disarmament, and this was open to all UN member states. And by our count, we had over 70 countries show up each time for these conversations on space norms. And I will say the conversations were really quite detailed. The first session, where we started talking about existing international law, we had some great discussions around the terms due regard and harmful interference, which are contained in the Outer Space Treaty. What do those mean? How do you implement those in practice? And in fact, we had lots of discussions around existing implementation of those in the maritime domain, for example. And so that really set a really good tone for our conversation as we talked about what do we mean by some of these terms? Are there ways that norms of responsible behavior could help us come to a common understanding of what those terms mean and how as an international community, we expected countries to behave? Then the second session was focused on the threats. And that was a really great opportunity, especially for us from the United States, to highlight Russia and China's weapon systems that they plan to deploy in space, and especially after Russia's November 2021 anti-satellite missile test, to highlight that these countries, which are out there promoting the non-placement of weapons in space, are actually developing capabilities that are weapons in space, and that they have tested these ground launch systems that have created large amounts of debris that have caused problems with the International Space Station and do generally present a risk to the international outer space environment in all countries' peaceful uses. It really was a great opportunity for us to educate many of the what we call the non-aligned countries. Some people call them the Global South. Give them a chance to really hear about what's going on in space and give them a sense of how this could impact their ability to use outer space in the future. And that really built their understanding of that, and also helped drive them to the understanding that, yes, norms are one way we could work to come up with solutions to this competition that is going on in outer space. And so then the third session, which occurred in January of this year, was when countries presented their proposals for different commitments. The United States submitted our own proposal. It is actually the first time that the United States, as an interagency, came together and presented a set of norms of responsible behavior. We took DoD's tenets as a starting point, but DoD's tenets were, are DoD's tenets. They are not a whole of government agreed set of proposals. And so we took those, we added in a few others, and this submission by us is actually the first time you start seeing us starting to define what harmful interference could look like. We talk about interference with national technical means of verification of arms control commitments as being of concern. Interference with nuclear command and control or missile early warning would be of a concern to the United States. We also get to discussions on due regard, where we start talking about flying your satellites in a safe and professional manner and maintaining safe trajectories. Now, we still have some work to do in terms of defining what those mean. What does a safe trajectory look like? What does professional behavior in space look like? But you can see, whereas in the air and maritime domains, we have some agreements on that. We don't always see countries comply with those agreements, but nonetheless, it gives us a foundation for starting to have that conversation on how we get to reducing the risk that our satellites are going to interact in ways that could cause crises or conflict. And then also, of course, importantly, we talked about debris, because the debris from the Russian ASAT test is a huge problem, and continuing to conduct those types of ASAT tests, we think would be a problem. That is why the vice president committed in January of last year, or to not do destructive direct ascent anti-satellite missile tests. And the amazing thing was, it was not just the United States putting forward proposals. There were lots of proposals that were put forward. There were proposals put forward by countries that weren't supportive of our position, but there were a lot of proposals from countries like Philippines and Germany and other countries that we found really very interesting. And so then we, of course, had the final meeting late August of this year. The scars are still fresh. I'm not going to really get into the details of what happened there. Go and read Teresa Hitchens's summary of it. She did a very good job of summarizing what happened in the end. But the end result was we did not reach consensus on a final report. That doesn't mean we failed. And frankly, in my position, I found the whole set of meetings to be very positive, and I think it was a huge success for the effort that we were trying to do. We have created a forum for discussion about norms of responsible behavior, whereas one did not exist before. We had an incredibly robust, in-depth conversation with a wide variety of countries about norms of responsible behavior. Also, in the midst of all of this, right, the US ran a resolution at the UN on destructive direct ascent anti-satellite missile testing. We got 155 countries to vote yes on it, 9 no's, Russia, China, Cuba, Syria, right? Okay, of course they were going to vote no. If you had told me in 2020, when we started this process, that in 2022, the US would run a space resolution at the UN on a single issue and would get 155 votes, I would have just laughed you out of the room, because that would have seemed impossible. But I really do feel that it was through the education that we did at this open-ended working group that we were able to get this strong support for a US-led initiative, which is not always something that happens quite frequently. And then the last thing I would say about the results, one of the papers submitted at the end was a 39-country cross-regional paper supporting norms of responsible behavior. It was led by the Philippines, signed by a lot of countries. It was not just the Philippines and 28 European member states and a bunch of our other allies. It really was cross-regional grouping with Brazil and other African countries all signing up to this, saying that norms of responsible behavior is a good approach, listing out some of the ideas that we should be taking forward. And there is a lot of work still to be done. We have differing definitions of things like rendezvous and proximity operations. To us, me coming into a room is a rendezvous with people. To others, rendezvous means actually physically touching another satellite. And so there's a whole lot of definitional work that needs to be done as we think about what to do about norms of responsible behavior in space. And while we don't have a final report, we don't have a ton of internationally agreed norms. Again, diplomacy is not something that occurs quickly. As much as we would all like to have a huge victory right at the beginning, when I look at the cyber domain at the UN, which is fairly comparable, it is new, it is difficult, it has some of the same challenges when it comes to legally binding, when it comes to establishing norms of responsible behavior. They're about 10 years ahead of us. Their first couple efforts failed as well, but then slowly but surely they started building upon and creating more defined norms of responsible behavior in cyber. And so it is my hope that we eventually get to a point where we are able to do and articulate those international agreed norms of responsible behavior. And again, I should mention, this is not something that is just the State Department out there alone and unafraid trying to impose on the Department of Defense. I had DoD with me, sitting next to me at the open-ended working group. They contributed to all of our papers and cleared on our guidance. So this is something that we see as being a cooperation with them, that we are trying to establish these to help Space Command as they consider their activities in space. Can these norms help them better regulate or better understand behavior? If we have communicated our understanding of behavior to China and Russia, and then they go out and conduct activities that are contrary to that understanding, then that gives them an opportunity to say, okay, our position on this. It is now, this is why we are going to react. And so next steps. So the open-ended working group has ended because its mandate was only for 2 years. We will be meeting in October at the United Nations First Committee in an effort to reestablish the open-ended working group mandate. We feel like those discussions were very positive. We think this would be a very positive way to take this forward. Not surprisingly, the Russians are not particularly happy with the way the open-ended working group went, and so they are going to offer a competing resolution on an open-ended working group that will call for a legally binding instrument on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. So just solely focused on constraining capabilities in space as opposed to talking about those important norms of responsible behavior. And then in November, Russia did establish what is known as a group of governmental experts. So whereas our open-ended working group is open to all United Nations states, this group of experts is limited to 25 states, where we will go off and deliberate on what to do about a legally binding instrument. We will undoubtedly raise all sorts of concerns about definitions and verification because there are still incredible challenges to go there. And so let me stop there. That's my summary of everything, and I'm happy to answer any questions anybody might have.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for that very insightful overview. You glossed over a little bit the Russian behavior, which I term obstreperous behavior. Can you just give a little more detail on the fact that they objected to formalizing the document and what that means? Just a little more context for people that may not follow the machinations of UN voting procedures and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Well, I'll put it this way. So when we started to review the draft text of the chairman, and the Russians objected to the title of the report, that's when we knew we were in trouble, that we weren't even going to get past that first line of text. Now, the way we had set up the open-ended working group was that it was a consensus-based document, and so we needed all countries in the room to agree to consensus on the report. That was both to protect us, as well as to make sure every country had their voice heard at the time. And so Russia obviously has concerns about the norms of behavior process. They discussed that quite clearly, that they don't feel that norms are an appropriate way to take these issues forward. In their system, it's either legally binding or it's a transparency measure. And so there's obviously some work for us to do there to try to work with them to convince them that this is an appropriate area of cooperation. There are areas where we know that they agree to norms of responsible behavior. Cyber is an important example of that. And so there will need to be more work on our part. Now, I will say the document wasn't anywhere near where the United States would have been able to agree to it either. You know, we were just in the beginning of still editing that document. We had lots of edits on our part that we would have liked to have seen included in that, same with many other countries there. So there was a lot of work that still needed to be done to make that into a polished document that all countries could sign up to.
And do you you mentioned some of the upcoming activities in October, for example, the UN First Committee and discussions on preventing an arms race in outer space. What are your expectations for those? Are you expecting continued obstreperousness on the Russians, or do you foresee significant progress coming up in the next few months? And if so, in which areas?
So that's a really good question. So at the First Committee, I think we will have some continued differences of opinion. The fact that they are proposing a different approach than what we are proposing is going to make it very challenging. You can't really have two processes going on simultaneous on these issues. Many countries would not be able to support something that met that often on two different completely subjects. So I think there will be a lot of calls for a merger of the two approaches that we are seeing here at the UN. So there will be a lot of debate up there. But I am optimistic. So in April of this year, the UN Disarmament Commission, which is a third body separate from all these others that we are talking about, met to discuss transparency and confidence building measures. And we did actually come out of that meeting with the same Russian counterparts and same Chinese counterparts from Capital, with agreement on countries supporting the implementation of certain transparency and confidence building measures. So for the first time, countries like China, Iran, and North Korea have agreed that they should do space launch notifications. Now, of course, it's a voluntary commitment, but certainly they seem to say that it's voluntarily a good idea to do space launch pre-launch notifications. And so that's an issue that we'll certainly be raising with those countries. And so there does seem to be a possibility of progress. Now, it's a great example. Like the report we were working off of there was from 2013. And so finally in 2023, we reached consensus on how to implement those. So it takes time, but we can get there through, a lot of work.
And are each of those bodies, do each of those bodies operate by consensus? In other words, can Russia or China or Syria or whomever object and throw sand in the gears in each case, or is it a majority vote? Or tell us a little bit more about the mechanism and how it gets adopted or not adopted.
Right. So most of the bodies are consensus. So the UN Disarmament Commission and the Conference on Disarmament and the Open-Ended Working Group were all things based on consensus. The group of governmental experts will work on the basis of consensus, but the UN First Committee, which reports to the UN General Assembly, operates on a simple majority vote, simple majority of those countries in the room at the time of the vote, to get a resolution passed. And so that will make it challenging for when we proceed in the fall, in October, on all of these issues, is figuring out how you get to that simple majority. And you could imagine a situation where it'd be possible to get two simple majorities on both the open-ended working group that we support and the one that the Russians are supporting.
Okay, and just a clarifying point. You made clear that because of Russian objections, there was no consensus on the most recent discussions. But at what point do nation states, the United States, for example, at what point are they obliged to comply with any of the agreements that are reached? Can you tell us a little bit more about what constitutes a binding agreement, and are those agreements, for example, submitted to the Senate for formal approval? How are they reviewed by not only within the administration, but by other branches of government, for example?
Right. So that's a really important question. We talk about the norms of responsible behavior being politically binding. They are not formal treaties that would be submitted to the Senate. And so if the report had reached a point where the United States government could endorse it, and that would have required some very late night, Thursday work here in Washington, D.C., when we would have sent the report back and said, can you live with this? And forced, all of our colleagues at Joint Staff and DoD and Space Command and NASA and the White House to really give it a final scrub. And I will say I had a lawyer with me as well to make sure that none of the language in the proposed report was binding on us in a legally binding sort of sense, or that it undercut the existing international obligations that we had, because we wanted to certainly avoid that. And there were some areas where some countries did not view international humanitarian law applying in outer space, which we felt was a significant walking back of existing commitments. And so we wanted to make sure that we didn't do anything in there that impacted those. And so because there was no consensus, the document is not politically binding on anybody. And in fact, though, if you do look at the language, it was clear that we did not have a whole lot of formal recommendations. The recommendations were areas for additional study, and it was very carefully caveated with the phrase, not contradicting any national positions. And that was very important for all of us, the Israelis, for many of our other allies, that we recognized that this was a list of topics, that this list of topics was topics that we wanted to discuss, like debris generating, topics that the Russians wanted to discuss, like placement of weapons in outer space, but that they were simply subjects for discussion. And in fact, we had started to see language go in there about states should consider. Right? It wasn't originally, it was states should, and we weren't particularly comfortable with that, because if you stripped away the chapeau language, somebody could pull that out and say, well, everybody agreed states should do this. Well, no, the chapeau is important, but that's why we would like to have seen, consider doing the following things, as opposed to it being a requirement to do those following things. But in the end, no document. So that document has zero standing at all. It's a lovely historical document of the work that we have done, but there is nothing that is consensus that states can say, this is where we need to be starting this conversation on.
Sure. And some of what you were referring to in terms of the particular constraints are included in, if I remember correctly, paragraph 48 or 49 of the document. And let me just read a couple of them, a couple or three, and if you could react to those and let us know, for example, my assumption is that some of these would cause significant problems for the United States from a national security standpoint, and that there might be interagency disagreement or rejection of some of these, but you tell me. For example, a couple of the provisions say, states shall not develop, deploy, or use electronic warfare capabilities to target space objects, or states should not develop, deploy, or use directed energy weapons to target space objects. States should consider not to develop, produce, test, or deploy weapons in space for any purpose. And as you mentioned earlier, those raise a lot of issues of definition, of a lot of longstanding problems with those kinds of constraints, verifiability, enforcement, compliance, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk about where the U.S. government is on some of the particulars of what some of the recommendations that were generated by others? Obviously, these weren't ideas that were promulgated by the U.S. They came from other nations. But can you tell us where those deliberations stand internally?
Right. So it's a really important point to recognize that we went into this conversation fully cognizant of the efforts that the Department of Defense needs to undertake to protect and defend both our space systems as well as the joint force from attacks using space systems. And so while those are subjects that other countries certainly wanted to discuss, our position was that we are open to having that conversation. We would be happy to come in and talk about our concerns about verification, about definitions, about what does it mean, why is electronic warfare permitted on ground and air and everywhere else, but not in outer space? What are the risks of electronic warfare? Now, one thing I should have mentioned is that our January submission to the open-ended working group talks very strongly about how these are what we consider peacetime norms. They are norms that are designed to help us understand better behavior, but that when conflict occurs, we think jamming is an appropriate response. That is why we publicly talk about having a counter communications system. And we have no intention of not having those capabilities. And so this was very much a recognition that countries really do want to talk about this, but that the United States is happy to come in and defend our position while also forcing Russia and China to defend their positions and calling them out on the activities that they are doing.
And let me ask you another question on the timing of the discussions. Russia has invaded Ukraine. The president and others have accused President Putin and Russian Federation of war crimes, for example. They have walked away from the New START Treaty, compliance with the New START Treaty. The Chinese are not interested in engaging with us in arms control on their what some have called nuclear breakout, for example. Is this the right time? You know, how do you judge when the right time is to be debating, discussing, possibly considering constraints on U.S. national security space systems when there are these other activities going on and/or a desire for a dialogue in other areas that is not being reciprocated?
Yeah. So first, I would say that we're not doing anything that constrains the activities of Space Command and Space Force in their development of capabilities. This is, again, about behaviors and how we would use our behaviors responsibly. We have a history of responsibly using these systems, and so these are consistent with the things that General Saltzman has been talking about the responsible use of outer space. Now, you're absolutely right. The timing has been difficult, but also beneficial, I think. You know, we established the open-ended working group in 2021, prior to any of us imagining that Russia was going to invade Ukraine the following year. And so that was just set in motion. The subject of the invasion became an issue during our first meeting. It was still very fresh. Most of us were calling the Russians out for the invasion, for their use of counter space systems. As we were sitting there, we all had just seen Russia conducting a cyber attack against the Viasat networks in Europe. And yet here they were calling that, for the prevention of any of these types of activities when they were clearly doing these activities. We actually ended up walking out of part of the first meeting because the Russians said some language that we as allies did not agree with, especially related to the regime, the Zelensky presidency and all of that. And so that was an opportunity for us to demonstrate our disagreement with the Russians. And then I think it was really very useful for some of the non-aligned countries to really see some of these Russian behaviors that were going on, their threats to space systems. I mean, in the middle of all of this, and they're claiming that, space should be peaceful only, they started threatening commercial systems. And so that was really helpful for them to see that this really is an issue, that competition really is going to extend into space. And I do think that helped us educate and bring a lot of these countries along on our quest to try to develop these norms of responsible behavior. Did
any or many of the states involved, states representatives involved in the most recent discussions in the OEWG, did they raise U.S. missile defense testing, Operation Burnt Frost, or other things and view that as problematic? The reason I raise it is because I and others have been involved in DoD policy on this kind of testing, on missile defense testing, and as you probably know, there are pretty significant constraints on how DoD conducts such tests. And in fact, minimizing debris is very clearly one of the key constraints in how you perform that kind of testing for the Missile Defense Agency or others. And likewise was in place, those constraints were clearly in place and influenced the design of how Operation Burnt Frost was conducted. But did folks raise that, and are you well prepared to counter any accusations that somehow those were irresponsible acts?
not irresponsible acts, but much of this discussion in the UN dates back to the 1980s after the president announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, right? The Russian draft treaty on the prohibition of the placement of weapons in space was first released in 1984, shortly after the president made his remarks. And so it has been since that time an attempt to constrain our ability to put missile defenses in space. They constantly raise this issue. To us, it's not as important a factor as the behaviors. How can we understand what a weapon is? It's hard to declare. Obviously, if MDA were putting things up there, they probably would be declared. But when the Russians and Chinese put things up there, they're not declared. And I will say the missile defense debate is in a much different place. When we did our anti-satellite missile testing moratorium, we were very careful to craft it that it is a destructive anti-satellite test. A missile defense test occurs in space, but neither the debris from the warhead nor the interceptor are actually in orbit. They are passing through space on a ballistic trajectory, and so therefore they are not covered by this commitment because we needed to protect that. And Russia and China are doing a lot more these days on missile defense as well. When you look at the mid-course system that China is developing, presumably they would not want to see themselves constrained in what sort of testing they could do, which is occurring in space as well. So I do think this is going to be less of an issue over the coming years, though undoubtedly Russia and China will continue to raise it in diplomatic circles because they have for decades, and it's hard for them to change their talking points.
Right. Those are well practiced talking points, aren't they? And I suspect yours in response are pretty well practiced as well. I may have used the same ones in Geneva 20, 30 years ago, in fact. Can you talk to us a little more? You mentioned this earlier about Russian proposals for the draft treaty, in fact, on prohibition of the placement of weapons in outer space, or other proposals that they're putting forth. What do you see as their strategic objectives here? And you at the very beginning, you emphasized the point that international opinion is shifting more in the direction of the U.S. because of the education efforts that have been undertaken, and probably some spillover from Chinese threats to Taiwan, and then of course the Russian invasion of Ukraine and other matters. But what is the level of support for some of the Russian or Chinese proposals in this regard, and how effectively are we parrying those efforts in various UN fora as well?
Yeah. So there are two proposals out there. There is the Russian no first placement resolution, which they will run again in October at the United Nations. Again, it's a simple concept. Many countries are against the placement of weapons in space. How could you be for the placement of weapons in space, right? And so they do get a lot of support. Although thanks to Russia's invasion, thanks to some of our diplomatic efforts, for the first time last year, we had 50 no votes. That is the largest of any of these resolutions that have no's against them. That finally is us being able to convince our allies and some of our partners that Russia is being incredibly hypocritical about that. But like I said, this is a simple majority. And so the resolution, which is non-binding, all UN resolutions are not, they are politically binding, but not even that much. It still passes, right? So that's the thing that you have to understand. The treaty that they have offered is the Treaty on the Prohibition of the Placement of Weapons in Space and the Threats or Use of Force Against Outer Space Objects, but we shorthandedly call it the PPWT. And so we have tremendous problems with definitions. Its definition of a space weapon is anything that could damage, disrupt, or destroy the operations of an object in outer space. But when you think about disrupt or damage, that could cover on-orbit servicing craft or active debris removal craft. And so we would have significant concerns about how you could actually define a weapon, but then how do you verify a weapon? We have talked publicly quite a bit about the weapons we think Russia has in orbit. We we have very good information that these are weapons, but the Russians have claimed that they are just inspector satellites. And so it comes down to, which country do you believe? We can't do verification. There isn't really a way to send a human up there to go and inspect the satellite in the way that we do arms control terrestrially. Although I will point out that the Outer Space Treaty does have inspection provisions. All facilities on celestial bodies are open to inspection by other countries. So someday I hoped to lead the first inspection of a foreign facility on the moon. Going to need my NASA colleagues' help for that. But also, something we've talked to our DoD colleagues about is that they are permitted to do activities on the moon, just as they are permitted to do activities in Antarctica, right? We have military personnel in Antarctica. C-17s deliver cargo there, but they are subject to inspection. And so DoD must in the future consider what it means to be inspected. It's not necessarily a near-term problem, but at some point it will become a reality. But coming back to the existing treaty, there are so many problems with it that we just don't think it is a viable option for going forward. And certainly we would not support negotiations based on that.
Thank you. The chairman's draft, the OEWG chairman's draft that we've been discussing states that states should strengthen supervision of private sector actors under their jurisdiction in accordance with Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty. What was the intent behind that recommendation, and what does it mean in a practical sense? I'm sure U.S. companies may have read that and said, what supervision are they trying to get at here? And what is the U.S. position on that particular provision?
Right. So obviously we feel like the United States does a very good job of supervising our commercial companies. Though, as you may know, the White House has started a process to figure out some of our supervision of systems and future capabilities that aren't necessarily regulated right now. Like, how do we do regulation of space tourism or space hotels? Because we don't know that we have a licensing process necessarily put in place for that. And so we do feel that there is always room for greater supervision. We certainly think among some of our competitor countries that we would like to see them do more regulation and make sure that they are regulating those activities. You may know that we sanctioned some Chinese entities for providing commercial imagery to Wagner-based entities for their use in Ukraine. And so we clearly think that the Chinese government may want to do more regulation of those entities as well. So for us, we think we're doing a very good job of regulation, but we would encourage all countries. And, one of the interesting things about the open-ended working group discussions is we would have a country like Iran calling for greater arms control agreements in outer space when they are not a party to the Outer Space Treaty. So even that provision of complying with not placing WMD in orbit, they are not technically bound by that, nor are they in the registration convention. And so their launching of satellites by the IRGC, they are not registering those with the United Nations. And so there certainly could be more compliance with the existing international legal framework that we would like to see as well.
And we have, let me touch a couple of questions from our audience. We have a question from Jeff Harris, former director of the NRO, who is a very active and helpful member of our board of advisors. So thank you for that, Jeff. And here's your question. He asks, in the UN process and education conversation, are deterrence on the one hand and cooperation on the other of equal importance, and how do norms help frame red lines for behavior in space?
So that's a really important question. Many of these countries do want cooperation. That is very important for those less developed countries, that they would like to see more cooperation. There are areas where we would love to see more cooperation as well. If we want to establish norms of responsible behavior, we need to develop ways to have countries observe those norms of behavior. Space situational awareness is a great area for cooperation. Can we work with more countries so that they develop their space situational awareness capabilities, so that when the United States calls out an irresponsible behavior, do other countries have the means of observing that behavior? And so there is language that you'll see that in the chairman's report that is agreed language about space cooperation. It is a very long and tortured paragraph that also protects our ability to not have to sell things that we wouldn't want to sell to countries, that permits us to have our export controls remain intact. But we do feel that the norms work will help with the establishment of those shared understandings. And so that if a behavior crosses those shared understandings, we haven't really established them yet, but there are some in the naval and air realms that you can imagine about interference. Vessels observing another vessel are not supposed to interfere with the progress or the safe passage of those vessels. That seems like something that should apply in outer space. As we conduct inspections of other countries' satellites, we wouldn't want them to interfere with us or us to interfere with them. And we have a very good track record of behaving responsibly there. You can imagine on-orbit servicing. We would never want a Chinese on-orbit servicer to park next to something that is a US government satellite. And so maybe there are behaviors that we can develop around that help us establish those clear expectations of behavior. And so that when those behaviors are not followed, we can turn to the country and at least start having the conversation of, hey, we've said this is the behavior we expect. We are seeing you operate in a way that is contrary to that. Knock it off, or that would allow the commander of Space Command to say, okay, we have established clear lines of what our expectations are, and now we are going to react because one of those lines has been crossed.
Take defensive measures of one character or another, right? Understand. Thank you. Another question from the audience is as follows. Was there any discussion in the OEWG regarding, quote, due regard and similar norms relevant to the increased potential for radio wave interference from increasingly congested orbital space, quote unquote?
Yeah, so, we did have a lot of conversations about due regard and trying to figure out what the intent of that language was when it was first drafted in the 1960s. Obviously, space has come a long way. There was a lot of discussion about the precedent of due regard in the UN UNCLOS, the Treaty on the Law of the Seas, and whether that provides us with some understanding of precedent of how they might have been considering it back in the 1960s. We don't have a lot of sort of what we would say legislative history of how they got to the term due regard. There was a lot of discussion, especially about radio frequency spectrum. There is a lot of discussion about Starlink in particular. The Iranians frequently raised the issue of Starlinks transmitting into their country. The Russians on multiple occasions have talked about how commercial entities should not be used in a conflict. We think they will run a resolution at the UN on that to say that companies should only provide peaceful uses of outer space and not support military activities. This is obviously because they are very far behind us in using and developing commercial capabilities. I feel that this is a bit of them trying to delay our ability to use commercial, though it is clear that commercial is such an important part of the activities that Space Command and Space Force are undertaking. And so most of our response was that this was not an appropriate issue, that if there are radio spectrum concerns, the ITU is just down the road from where we were meeting, and that would be a more appropriate location. If there were concerns about large constellations of satellites, then UN COPUOS, the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which meets in Vienna, is also prepared to take up that issue about deconflicting orbits. So for us, it was mostly not an issue that we wanted to talk about. We were there to talk about space threats. At one point, our Iranian colleague also wanted to talk about lunar resource mining. And we also pointed out that that is clearly not a space security matter. It needs to be discussed in the appropriate body and not there at Geneva.
Thank you. Wanted to turn to the position of China in this. Can you give us a little update on the position of China on some of these key issues, how active they were, what their central talking points were, themes that they were putting forward, and what you see, how their position might evolve over time in these talks?
So China is really interesting. You mentioned earlier that China is unwilling to engage on nuclear arms control discussions, whereas in space, they are the co-sponsor, the co-drafter of this treaty on the prohibition of placement of weapons in space. So unlike the nuclear realm, they actually have an arms control proposal out there for countries to consider. And so a lot of their talking points focused on the importance of countries not placing weapons in space. If you look at their submissions, and so they did submit many documents to the UN Open-Ended Working Group. Those are available online. If you do a Google search of OEWG space threats, you'll pull up the webpage that has many of the documents on there. And so China was very active throughout these conversations. You can see in their documents that they are focused on things like the creation of the Space Force. They comment quite a bit about the Space Force doctrine, and they view that the doctrine can be viewed as being threatening, that by having this document publicly, that we are talking about war fighting in space, and they claim that they do not want to see conflict occurring in space. Obviously, we feel differently. They created the Strategic Support Force many years before we created the Space Force. They have ground-launched anti-satellite missile systems that are designed to destroy satellites in space. And so we are being criticized for being open and transparent, which we think is important, especially as we talk about doctrines so that other countries can understand our approach to space security. But they're being non-transparent, not talking about what their doctrine is, when clearly they have a professional military. They must also have doctrines and plans and tactics as well. And so we're hopeful that we'll be able to continue that conversation with them and start to have the discussion on how our two countries operate responsibly with each other in space. I mean, the United States and China, unlike in the nuclear realm, are the #1 and #2 spacefaring nations in terms of numbers of satellites, in terms of numbers of launches. And so we do think it is important to continue to have a conversation with them as our satellites start interacting in outer space, so that we don't have the collisions that you might see here on, in the air or in the terrestrial domain.
And do you see any daylight between the positions that the Russians and the Chinese are taking in these talks? They may emphasize different aspects of more or less the same thing, same concerns. But have you encountered any daylight between the two? Or are they more or less in lockstep in terms of their support for different resolutions or their voting patterns or that kind of thing?
I mean, I think there have been times where they have had disagreements. When we met in April at the UN Disarmament Commission, there was a period of time where it was Russia and China disagreeing with each other on specifics of language. And so I don't necessarily know that they're in complete lockstep on everything, but they do emphasize a lot of the same issues. Though I, hope to be able to someday have a conversation with my Chinese counterparts. If we restrict commercial to only peaceful purposes, well, they have a lot of commercial capabilities. And so are they saying that Beidou is only a military system and no one should use that for commercial purposes, or that their commercial companies should not sell satellite imagery to other countries? So, I think they have a lot of interests in outer space. They too want to make money from commercial entities, so-called commercial entities. And so I think there is more convergence between our positions on some of these issues than there will be divergence in the future.
Thank you. And I think we have time for a couple more questions. You talked eloquently, Eric, about the education of the international community and how that led to progress on the value of norms, and that that discussion and detailed interactions with other nations, how important that can be to changing their views or reinforcing U.S. policy, et cetera, et cetera. It raises a question in my mind. U.S. military forces, and especially space forces, are absolutely critical to the defense of our friends and allies. Do you think we do a good enough job in helping reinforce those messages on the value of space to their defense and to continued international stability and beating back aggression, that kind of thing? Were those kinds of talking points involved in your and your colleagues' actions in this particular forum? Are those deployed in some of the other forums, or how well do you think we do that in general? And do you see that those efforts are bearing fruit?
So I will say I greatly appreciate the cooperation that we have with Space Force and Space Command and DoD in general on all of these issues in terms of getting our message out, and in terms in particular about doing actual cooperation. First of all, not really well known, but the State Department and the Defense Department have an exchange program. And so I have 2 Space Force military detailees working in my office, which is just incredible to have people with real space experience, so that when I come up with some norm of responsible behavior, they're like, wait, I've operated satellites. The physics don't work like that. Don't even bother with that. But they have been incredible in helping us connect with Space Command and Space Force as they do their international outreach. Just the other, I think it was earlier this year, we put a telescope, the Space Force put a telescope down in Chile that they look to work with the Chileans in terms of helping them develop their SSA capabilities. That sort of cooperation is essential. It's not something the State Department can do. A, we don't have the money, and B, we don't have the expertise. But that sort of cooperation with allies and partners around the world is just going to be tremendous in helping talk to these countries, helping them decide that they want the United States to be the partner of choice as opposed to other countries. And so I think they are doing a great job. We look forward to working with them more. I've been, again, they've come to us and coordinated their international outreach programs with us, which has helped us, bring synergy together in terms of what are our objectives, what are their objectives, and trying to do that internationally. And I will say, one of the other things, our allies and partners are in a much different place on space security matters, and it is largely due to the work that the Department of Defense has done. Our closest allies, when you think about NATO declaring space as an operational domain, that Article 5 applies in outer space. That's a really important agreement. We now have that agreement with the Japanese as well, that Article 5 of the US-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty applies in space. And so more and more, they are recognizing that their space assets are vulnerable and that they need to do more. And more, they're realizing that they don't want norms of responsible behavior, that they will need to do things to protect and defend their space systems. I'm sorry, they don't want arms control, but that norms are the most appropriate path forward on how we address these space threats. Because the French have talked publicly about Russian satellites getting close to their satellites. And so they too have been on the receiving end and are concerned about behaviors.
Right. And last question. There have been some in commenting on the results of the OEWG who are saying essentially that this is progress, that progress has been made, and are taking the next step to essentially assert that the Biden administration has now made a decision that they want to go the direction of space arms control. And and others view that as a slippery slope. Longstanding policy that you elaborated that dates back to at least the Reagan administration. Any such agreement would need to be equitable, verifiable, effective, support the national security interests, et cetera, et cetera. How do you view that? There will be some who say congratulations on bringing the international community along, but at the same time, you've sort of opened the door to a lot of ideas that the U.S. can't live with. How do you reconcile that? How do we? What's the end game here in trying to get to something that's useful, that takes into account international views, but does not hinder necessary U.S. National security space capabilities?
So I guess I will say that I think both the desire for norms of responsible behavior and the limitations on what we could agree to on space arms control are consistent over multiple administrations. And I don't think anything has changed. It will change on our position on what we want to see. Those are effectively very good criteria for what we would seek in a space arms control agreement. We aren't there. We don't feel the need for those sorts of legally binding issues at the time being. And even if we were, you're talking so many years to negotiate something. And that's why we think norms of responsible behavior can be done more quickly. There is precedent. Everybody knows that the 1968 Outer Space Treaty had provisions on no WMD and nuclear weapons in space. In 1963, the UN actually passes a resolution that says countries commit not to placing weapons in outer space. So it takes 4 years for it to actually get included in a treaty in the future. And so we do think like we can get out there, we can get norms done quickly. Not all of them are going to be appropriate for a legally binding treaty. When you talk about safe trajectory, and professional behavior, that's not something you would necessarily put in an arms control treaty. That is instead something you would come up with state practice that you could apply rules of the road to. Although technically, when you think about the Incidents at Sea agreement, that is legally binding between the United States and Russia. Many of our allies in Europe have similar, but in Asia, they have the Code of Unplanned Encounters at Sea, or CUES. And if you look at that, that is a non-binding political commitment that uses much of the same language from the Incidents at Sea agreements, but just in a non-binding form. We think that we can pursue everything we need for the time being, non-binding, through these political commitments, through these norms of responsible behaviors, and we think that's the best approach going forward. And we think that there's a lot of agreement, though I will say, many of those non-aligned countries would love to see legally binding space arms control. They agree with us that norms can be done quickly, but if there was a push to move forward, they probably would be supportive of that. And that's where, we need to make sure they understand fully our concerns about these issues, about verification, about what the definitions are.
And this that reinforces the point you made earlier about education is imperative. Interactions between not only State Department, but Space Command, Space Force, and others comes into play in a serious way. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Eric. I think all who have been watching this and all who know you know what a fantastic job you do. You know your brief, you know it well. You give credit to the term government employee, and we're very glad you're doing what you're doing. So thank you very much for your time again, and please thank you as well to our audience. Good questions that were submitted, and we look forward to seeing you on the next SpaceTime interview series. So Eric, have a great day. Good luck in your future negotiations and deliberations with our friends, allies, and sometimes adversaries. So we look forward to having you back again soon with another update, but thank you for appearing today.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to the audience for coming to listen to this.
Sounds great. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.